Now, there's two types of content creators on YouTube. There's the types who will push a narrative without producing any evidence to support their side of the story. And then there's those who may still push a narrative, but they come with receipts to back up their argument. And let's be fair, we all have our biases when it comes to a case. Whether it's because someone has shouted the loudest and we've believed them, whether it's because we just don't like the look of someone, or whether it's because we've actually looked at all the facts in front of us and made an educated decision based on that. It is still possible to look at all the facts in front of you, make an educated decision and be wrong. Why am I saying this? Because the content creator that I want to discuss today is someone who, while I disagree with his coverage of the Idaho 4 case, I will admit that he always comes with receipts to back up his arguments. Now, ironically, I followed this creator during the Summer Wells case, and at the time I commented to him that I was glad that, unlike another creator from the UK who was covering Summer's case, he wasn't fixed on one theory and pushing that theory no matter what. Although I would have to say, probably the difference between him and this other creator is that he would occasionally, with the Idaho 4 case, present videos that showed the other point of view. But the majority of his videos, since quite early on in the case, have all been leaning towards supporting Bryan Kohberger. Now, like I said, this individual makes an educated argument. The problem is that he has a large following, and the multitude of other YouTubers who have jumped on board the bandwagon and started presenting their content in terms of Bryan is innocent without actual solid information to back it up, just screaming, "Conspiracy, conspiracy," and whipping up their audience to the point where anyone who suggested that Bryan could be actually guilty was being attacked. Unwittingly, this original content creator created an environment on YouTube where the bulk of the content that existed was pro-Bryan Kohberger, because anyone who saw the other side of the argument was pretty much hounded off YouTube. It just wasn't worth your while to try and speak up, because the Prohbergers, as so many people refer to them now, would come out of the woodwork and attack your channel. I avoided addressing anything to do with this case, up until the point when Bryan actually chose to enter a plea deal. I was avoiding this case like the plague because of the misinformation, because of the people who were twisting the facts for the purpose of trying to defend Bryan Kohberger. And as mentioned, when you take a closer look, this whole Prohberger movement traces back to this one content creator. Now, I'm not going to ask him to answer this question, because obviously this is important for him in terms of how he manages his channel. But my question all along was, does he truly believe that Kohberger could be innocent? Or is this a somewhat clever strategic way of marketing his channel to bring in the views? It works for Vinnie Politan, so why shouldn't it work for Harsh Reality? Now, I do want to point out that while I disagree with his take on this case, I do see Harsh Reality as a credible content creator. He doesn't create clickbait. If he has a point of view that he wants to share, If you see that on the thumbnail of his video or in the title of his video, he's going to intelligently argue his case. Whether or not he's right is a different story. Of course, the problem with this case is that there was, of course, that pesky order by the courts, which meant that we couldn't get a lot of information on the case as we were heading up towards the trial. Instead, people had to rely on filings made by both sides and on whatever was put out by the media. And just like the Delphi case, you had the prosecution doing their best to manipulate the public by putting out filings that were intended to create that pro-Berger sentiment. So, of course, it seemed when Kohberger finally made that plea that this would be the end of the pro-Berger movement and we could move on, have sentencing and let these 4 young people finally be at rest. At first, the Prohbergers slunk away into the woodwork. Now here's where I disagree with Harsh's approach, because numerous people, probably people who like myself used to follow his channel, but became somewhat weary of his Prohberger stance, these people came forward and asked Harsh, would he be offering an apology? Would he be admitting that he was wrong? And look, I will confess, in my video that I did about Bryan making his plea deal, I made a specific comment directed at Harsh saying, are you going to admit now that Bryan is guilty? This was Harsh's response, not to me, but to all the people who were approaching him and saying, are you going to now admit that you were wrong?
I have tried to stay as neutral as possible, and my stance has always, like Fred's admit you was wrong. Please tell me how I was wrong. I don't, please somebody tell me in what way, shape, or form I was wrong. Well, I was wrong to give him the benefit of the doubt, because that's what I did. Do you know what I mean? That's the point here. At no point did I say Bryan Kohberger is 100% innocent. He definitely didn't do it. My point was that I didn't feel that he had been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and that anybody saying that we didn't need to go to trial and that he deserved to be executed now, like it was a done deal, I didn't fall in that camp. There was a lot of things around this case that I felt didn't sit right, and I felt that there was a potential that he could have been innocent.
So that was as close as Harsh came to saying, yes, I was wrong. Basically saying, no, I never said Kohberger was innocent. I just thought there was a possibility and I didn't want to convict him outright. Okay, fair point. But the thing is, Harsh, the majority of your videos were pushing that there was a conspiracy against Kohberger. The majority of your videos were pushing that there was not enough evidence. The majority of your videos were targeting the surviving housemates, the families of the victims, and basically trying to put them in a bad light. The majority of your videos were pro-Berger. So you will need to forgive people for believing that that was your stance. You will need to forgive people for requesting that you admit that you were wrong, because it certainly appears that your channel was a pro-Berger channel, and still is. Now, it's easy to get so deeply invested in a case that when it appears to be resolved, you don't want to stop talking about it. or in the Summer Wells case, where it seems to be a cold case, there are still people who continue to talk about it because that's what they've built their channel on. Now, Harsh has a huge following, so it's not like he needs the Kohberger case to keep the views coming in for his channel. He could cover anything he wanted on his channel and still get the views. But since Bryan entered that plea deal, Harsh has continued to talk about Bryan Kohberger. And as you can see from his thumbnails, there's still that whole leaning towards him being innocent. So when I was scrolling through YouTube this morning looking for something different, I came across one of Harsh's most recent videos. And I'm always up for a good debate. So I watched part of this video and decided that I wanted to do a response to this video. Now, I'm just going to say, like I've mentioned, I do have respect for Harsh. I disagree with his stance. And I have not followed his Idaho 4 content since early on in the case because I felt that he did have a bias towards Bryan Kohberger. But I respect him because when he puts forward an argument, he explains why he feels that way. He backs up his arguments. And like I said, I think everyone who covers different cases, every YouTube creator, is probably going to have some sort of bias with every case that they cover. And there is the risk of confirmation bias. You form an opinion and you look for things that are going to support your opinion and you ignore the things that don't. I'm not saying that this is a case of confirmation bias, it could be, but I do want to look at Harsh's latest video and comment on a few things in this video.
This is the guilty plea problem. And what we're going to be looking at in here is the fact that the US does have a problem with people pleading guilty to crimes that they have not indeed committed.
Now, I will give him credit. He's actually taken the time to go and find an article that supports his viewpoint. So credit to him for that. But can we just acknowledge that quite often when you go find articles on the internet, you have to question the source of those articles and you have to question where the information is coming from.
And then we're going to listen to Judge Jed Rakoff actually talking about it. But innocent people are pleading guilty to crimes they did not commit. It happens to countless people each year, and there's no telling how many are behind bars as a result.
So straight up you have a heading, a title that shows bias. They are saying that it happens to countless people each year. But they can't present a statistic on that. All they're saying is there's no telling how many are behind bars as a result, meaning we don't have statistics. We don't have evidence that there are countless people doing this every year. We're just using this to persuade you. There might be lots and lots of people behind bars, but we're not going to show you the evidence. This is just us presenting a theory. When someone says there's no telling how many are behind bars as a result, that's basically saying, well, we haven't actually asked all these people who are currently incarcerated if they are innocent. We haven't actually got proof that they are innocent, but we're going to make this presumption based on who knows what to try and convince our audience that this is correct. Straight up, they are using persuasive language. Countless people. We can't count those people because we actually don't have statistics. And there's no telling. Again, we can't tell you because we don't have solid facts.
When most people learn that a person pleaded guilty to a crime, they believe the person must have done it. Yet the number of wrongful convictions exposed over the last 25 years has proven that reasoning to often be unsubstantiated. In fact, nearly 11% of the nation's 362 DNA based exonerations since 1989 involved people who pleaded guilty to serious crimes they didn't commit. Furthermore, according to the National Registry of Exonerations, 18% of known exonerees pleaded guilty.
Okay, so straight up you can see where this argument is coming from. The argument here is that there have been 362 DNA-based exonerations since 1989. And 11% of those, that's a really tiny number, 1 in 10, was people who pled guilty. Now here's why we need to be cautious of accepting this argument when it comes to Kohberger. The date here is significant, 1989. Why is that? Because that's when we were in the infancy of DNA science, and that science has progressed rapidly since the early 90s. Now they can actually get DNA off a rock. They can get DNA off things that have been submersed in water. They have all these new ways of getting DNA which are far more sophisticated than they were back in 1989. Back when you basically just about needed someone to leave a chunk of skin there for you to get DNA. And DNA isn't the only area of forensics that has progressed exponentially since the late 80s, meaning that it is much harder these days to get a wrongful conviction because of the ability to use forensics to achieve that conviction. I think that if you were to actually dig in and have a look at all these exonerations that have existed, then you would see that most of them were from circumstantial evidence, not a lot of solid forensic evidence, because going back even 10 years, the science was not as good as what it is now. Now it is far easier to get a solid conviction through forensic science. The sort of arguments that could have seen someone convicted back in 1989 would probably not hold water unless they had solid science behind them. Defence teams now have the benefit of science to help them protect someone who is innocent from a guilty verdict. Now that doesn't mean that someone can't still be convicted of a crime that they didn't do. But the thing is, if you were to actually have a look at the circumstances behind those convictions, you would see that these DNA-based exonerations were because of improvements in forensic science. I'm willing to bet that if you looked at it in a sliding scale, that 11% of individuals who had pled guilty even though they were innocent, you would find that the majority of them date back further than the year 2000. At least in a scale. There would be far fewer people these days who would be likely to plead guilty to avoid a death sentence because of forensic science. because they would know, if they were innocent, that the forensics would prove that they were innocent. They would know that if they were innocent and they were somehow given a guilty conviction, that there was an appeals process. This argument is based on old science.
While it's hard to believe that the United States criminal justice system could be so deeply flawed that innocent people are convicted of crimes they didn't commit, it's even harder to fathom that some of these innocent people actually felt compelled to plead guilty, often in exchange for a reduced sentence or to avoid the death penalty. When so many innocent people are agreeing to their own wrongful convictions, it's time to acknowledge that something is very wrong. The plea system is not a bargain, it is a problem that has no regard for innocence.
So I'd like to see this argument made with statistics from a far smaller period of time. Because when you start including statistics from the 90s and from the early 2000s, then they are not going to be reflective of the criminal justice system today. Including these statistics from people who made pleas back in the 90s and early 2000s is deceptive because it does not account for the advances in forensic science. It is so much harder now to convince a jury of someone's guilt if you don't have the forensic science to back you up.
The guilty plea problem doesn't occur just at the front end of the system. It also happens after people have taken the extraordinary step of demonstrating through solid evidence and often decades in prison that they were in fact innocent. People who have spent years fighting to both prove their innocence and to go home are faced with yet another impossible choice: go home immediately or much sooner without being exonerated, or take the risk of being reconvicted at trial. Instead of vacating their convictions on the basis of innocence, the prosecution offers the wrongly convicted a deal.
So this is now going off at a tangent that really doesn't connect at all to Bryan Kohberger's case, because this is talking about people who have been convicted by a jury and who have spent time being incarcerated because of a guilty verdict and who have then reached an agreement so that they could have their freedom rather than wait to be properly exonerated. Bryan Kohberger was not convicted by a jury of his peers. He chose to make a plea. So this has got nothing to do with a post-conviction appeal.
Plead guilty, have your sentence reduced, and go home. In some cases, the plea allows the defendant to still say they are innocent even while pleading guilty. Regardless, the system fails because it places resolving cases through pleas over uncovering the truth. It also denies wrongly convicted people the justice they deserve and burdens them with a criminal record and the severe collateral consequences that follow, including being denied jobs, housing, the ability to spend time with their children, and the right to vote, as well as a lack of compensation for years wrongly served in jail. So this is basically saying, it's got to the point now where the process isn't about finding out what actually happened. It's just about ticking a box and getting the case closed. Do you know what I mean? And they're shown countless times that they are willing to do that. They are willing to just tick the box and say this is done.
Okay, this is a really problematic argument because what he is essentially arguing here is that in the case of someone before going to trial pleading guilty, that this is about ticking boxes and just closing the case. But the thing is, that is not what this article is saying. This article points out this is talking about people who have been unfairly convicted, people who have spent time in jail after receiving a conviction and have then subsequently launched an appeal, and rather than going through the whole process of proving their innocence, have come to an agreement where they have said, I'm innocent, but I'm going to plead guilty so I can go free. And then that impacts on them because they still have that record. This is not relevant to Bryan Kohberger. Sure, in those instances, it is about ticking a box as opposed to finding out what truly happened. When these agreements happen where someone says, I'm going to plead guilty even though I'm not innocent so that I can be set free, these are people who have been found guilty by a jury of their peers. These are people where there has been an agreement made that, well, when we look at the information that we have here, 20, 30 years on, now that forensic science has progressed, yes, it does appear that you are innocent, but rather than have a protracted appeal where we go through the whole case again, where you could possibly lose your appeal because perhaps there are still some things that make you look bad, then you can make this plea. Now, I'm sure that if someone was in a position where there was so much forensic evidence that pointed to another person and completely cleared them, that they wouldn't enter into this plea agreement. This would more often than not be with people where there is still evidence that could put in doubt their innocence. And so they enter this plea because it gives them their freedom. They enter this plea because the whole appeal process could be extremely lengthy, and maybe they've already spent 20 years in jail and they don't want to spend the next 10 years in jail. Imagine being in a position where you've been locked up for 10, 20 years and you've had the belief that you would never ever get free. And someone came to you and said, I'm going to give you your freedom. You can say you are innocent, but if you enter this guilty plea, even though you are innocent, we'll let you walk tomorrow. Or you can sit here in this cell for another 10 years while we fight it. And there's a chance that we might lose and you could still be here for the rest of your life. Of course, these people are going to accept that plea. Like I said, this has got nothing to do with Bryan Kohberger. Yes, you can say, like I said, that in those cases, it's about ticking the box and closing the case. But here's the thing. Pre-trial, when someone enters a guilty plea, there is still the sentencing process. You heard the prosecution present an abbreviated version of their case to the judge prior to when Bryan made his plea. And aside from all that, this is 2025. We are so much further ahead now with forensic science, so that there is enough evidence for us to know what happened, to close this case and know solidly that yes, this guy who's pleading guilty was actually guilty because the science supports that claim. You can't compare these two processes because they are totally different.
Thank you very much, Deb. Thank you very much. We are all entitled to a criminal justice system that is fair, just, and that adheres to the Constitution's promise of a fair trial. And yet we live in a broken system that no one deserves. Prosecutors who threaten scared youth with harsh sentences, including the death penalty, incentives that make taking pleas over trial the most rational choice, overburdened and under resourced public defense systems that can't provide adequate representation, and judges who fail to serve as a check on the truth and justice. To make matters worse, there's little incentive for challenging the status quo because ultimately plea deals keep an overburdened and dysfunctional system moving along. If every person charged with a crime demanded a trial, the system would be brought to a halt within a matter of hours. Sadly, our system relies on plea bargains.
So this paragraph is not referring to people who spend 2 years preparing for a trial and then pull the plug because they've been shown that the evidence against them is insurmountable. This is referring to people who choose not to go to trial in the first place. Young people who don't understand the justice system, who don't understand that forensic science could clear them if they are innocent. Young people who have been pressured to enter a guilty plea because they are too young and uneducated to know better. Yes, the whole system is overburdened. That's the case in every country. But saying that it was a rational decision to do so in Bryan's case, and that this pressure came to relieve an overburdened system. No. There was time put aside for this trial. And to claim inadequate representation when Harsh has been arguing that Ann Taylor is the greatest defence lawyer for who knows how long. His argument has never been inadequate representation. And as for it being the most rational decision, for someone with a criminal master's degree, then it would only be the most rational decision if you were in fact guilty. We're talking about someone who has an intimate knowledge of the criminal justice system.
Money. This is money again, isn't it? How much was the trial and how much was the mechanics of the trial going to cost?
Well, comparatively, after 2 years of heading towards this trial, the cost of the trial is somewhat minimal. Most of the cost has already been borne for this trial. They were on the home stretch. So the additional cost of actually going through the trial process really was going to be a drop in the ocean compared to the cost of getting to this point.
There are no easy solutions to fixing this problem, but for the sake of the many innocent people trapped by a broken system, we must do something. The Innocence Project and 56 members of the Innocence Network across the country are committed to raising awareness about the over-reliance on guilty pleas at every stage of the system.
Ding, ding, ding. That's where your article comes from. The Innocence Project and the Innocence Network. Of course, this article is going to be skewed in favour of their argument in terms of getting innocent people free.
But change only comes when the public demands it.
And that just goes on to say, we invite you to join our campaign to fix America's guilty plea problem. Help us spread the word about this injustice and know that we will call on you when we need you to contact your lawmakers and demand change. We all need to work together to protect the innocent who are trapped in an overwhelmed and broken system.
Right, so let's go on here. This is what we want to look at now. So this is US District Judge Jed S. Rakoff, and he's going to talk about America's guilty plea problem.
I won't play through all that. You can go and listen to it on Harsh's channel if you are interested in it. But his argument is that basically the number of cases going to trial has diminished significantly since 1985, and that there are more people entering pleas rather than going to trial. And then you get the same statistics from the Innocence Project. Now, again, this whole interview with this judge is skewed in favour of the Innocence Project, as you can see. And once again, there is a tendency here to ignore the fact that while courts probably are becoming more clogged up, that also the reasoning for there being more cases that don't proceed to trial is because there would be a much higher percentage of people who have been basically got banged to rights because of forensic science. The advances in forensic science since 1985 mean that it is so much easier to prove unequivocally that someone is guilty. And if you can see that there is solid evidence to show that you are guilty, and you can get a lesser sentence because of that, of course you are going to enter a guilty plea. So this argument is not taking into account the advances in forensic science. 1985, nobody was convicted on DNA evidence. If we look at the flip side of this, there are countless cases from before these advances in forensic science where people have been looked at in a case and not convicted and basically left to be free because of the lack of forensic evidence, because they didn't have that science then. And now these people are being highlighted as being guilty. So this goes both ways. The big difference here that people are ignoring is the huge, huge advances in forensic science. I would imagine that if we revisited this in another 10 years, then there may be even fewer cases that go to trial, because those people have been proven guilty unequivocally, because those people recognise that there is so much forensic evidence against them that it is in their best interests to prove guilty and get a lesser sentence.
It's like what I said. There's a massive death as a motivator. Death is a huge motivator. It's all right for people to say, "Oh, nobody's going to plead guilty to a crime that they didn't commit," but do you know what I mean? It's like, can you imagine being in a position where you are potentially being told, "Look, I don't know what to tell you. We're going to go to trial. I'm not prepared for this." And I touched on this the other day. When you turn around and say, the worst case scenario is you get found guilty and you have to face a death penalty. That's just as simple as that. Do you know what I mean? And what would that put your family through? Do you know what I mean? It's a difficult one. And look, I'm not sitting here to turn around and say Bryan Kohberger is innocent. I've got no doubt in my mind that Bryan Kohberger is innocent. What I'm saying is we've got to a point where he's admitted to this crime, and we've still got a situation where the questions that existed before this still exist. And do you know what I mean? Those questions don't vanish; they don't disappear. The fact that Bryan Kohberger turns around and says, "Yeah, I'm guilty. Yes, guilty, 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 all the way through." It's proven just in this short here by Judge Jed. Do you know what I mean? I just don't know. Do you know what I mean? I don't. people will plead guilty, and I get that some people feel that he's guilty, and I don't blame why you think that he's guilty, because there's so many things that have been pushed out there that are incomplete, but when they're left incomplete, they do point to guilt. The needle is moved, but the point being, we've not had any ability to see the other side of the argument, because that's been taken away now. And this has been going on since the very beginning, from the very, very start, when he should have had a preliminary hearing. That was taken away, goes to a grand jury. We hear that the grand jury aren't even 100% sure, but lo and behold, fast forward to literally weeks before the trial, and it's a case of, yeah, we're not going to trial anymore. Bryan Kohberger's all of a sudden just pled guilty.
Okay, first of all, this argument that there's been this pendulum swing and that there's been all this incomplete evidence that's come out that make people now believe that Bryan's guilty, and we haven't seen the other side of the story. We've had the other side of the story pushed onto us for the past 2 years. I'm sure more people could present the various, in my opinion, flawed arguments for Bryan's innocence than could actually present the factual, evidence-based arguments for his guilt. I'm going to start by pointing out that this is someone who has studied criminology. This is someone who knows exactly how the justice system works. Someone who, if he believed that he had a chance of proving innocence, wouldn't give up the fight this close to trial, not after 2 years of getting to this point. Bryan Kohberger's not some bumbling country hick who has no knowledge of the criminal justice system, who is easily pressured by his defence team to make a decision based on what they want and not based on what is best for him. Bryan Kohberger knows enough of the criminal justice system that had he thought that he could have actually received an innocent verdict, then he would have stuck it out. He knew they had him banged to rights, so he made a guilty plea to avoid ending up on death row. This is someone with an intimate knowledge of the criminal justice system. He's not going to shoot himself in the foot and deny himself due process if he believes he is innocent. Because if he was innocent, he would have continued to fight it. He would have understood that there was an appeal process after the trial which would allow him to continue to fight. But instead, he entered a guilty plea. He will never be free. He does not have any chance now of appealing the process. He understood that because he has that intimate knowledge of the criminal justice system. Now, we won't know till after sentencing what is in that entire case. But here's what we do know. There was a record of him purchasing that K-bar knife from Amazon. There were phone pings, 23 phone pings, which place him in the direct vicinity of that house between July the 9th and when the crime occurred. He returned to that house at 9 a.m. the morning afterwards. There is a combination of surveillance videos from businesses and from residents which showed his vehicle entering the town just after 3 a.m. It showed his car circling the street where the victims lived. And on camera, it shows his car doing a U-turn at an intersection and then returning and parking behind and above the house. Now, if you were following this trial at the beginning and you watched the interview room, there was a video that was done by Chris McDonough where he actually went to the scene, and he went into the rear car park and he identified a trail camera in that rear car park. That trail camera is where that footage would have come from. You have a witness who was inside the house and identified Bryan as being the individual who was there in the house. Turns out we have a witness who did a DoorDash to the house, and she was parked behind Bryan's car. She saw his vehicle. She saw him at the house. You have two witnesses who can place him on scene. You have camera footage of his vehicle leaving the area at a high rate of speed after the crime occurred. And you have him attempting to purchase a new sheath for his K-bar knife. You have a sheath with his DNA on it in a spot that he couldn't quite get clean, because it appears that he thoroughly cleaned that sheath prior to committing the crime, but he messed up and he dropped that sheath and it ended up under the body of one of the victims, and it had his DNA in a location that he had not cleaned. You have a vehicle that has been cleaned to forensic levels. A vehicle that would have essentially been stripped out to have been cleaned and to remove any evidence of that crime. He attempted to delete his Amazon purchase history. He attempted to change the registration plates on his vehicle from Pennsylvania to Washington. And sure, you could argue, well, that's because he was living there. But we are looking at the weight of the evidence. That on its own surely is nothing. But when you look at all his other actions, it just adds to the evidence against him. This is an individual who wrote a detailed paper on crime scene processing. He understood what was necessary in order to try and prevent him being linked to the crime. And here's what I believe is motive. And that is, like I said, he was a criminology student. From what we've heard, he was a bit of a fan of Ted Bundy, and he had thoroughly researched Ted Bundy. In fact, it turns out that prior to this crime, he had been watching a documentary about Ted Bundy. And it is said that he had dressed himself like Ted Bundy. So even before I'd heard about his obsession with Bundy, there was something that really stood out to me from the very beginning with this case, and that is the similarity to a significant Bundy crime, and that is the college murders of 1978. So this is January 15th, 1978, and it was at a sorority house at FSU. Funny thing is, this was an off-campus residence and it was known as the party house. Ring a bell? Anyway, let's have a look at what happened with this particular case. So Bundy entered through the back door of the house because of a faulty lock. He then proceeded to attack a number of the residents within that house, using a lump of wood that he had found on scene. He also choked one of his victims with a nylon stocking. He attacked 2 victims who did not survive. And this all happened in a really short period of time. Then he moved on to 2 other victims. Now, I would need to go back over the story to be clear, but it seems that these victims either had adjoining rooms or shared a room. And what occurred is that Bundy attacked the first victim, and then because the other victim was present, he then left that first victim and attacked her. And I saw an interview with her a few years ago where she basically claimed that the thing that rescued her, the thing that made Bundy stop and flee, was somebody dropping off his girlfriend in the car park because the headlights of his car shone into the room where Bundy was attacking her, and Bundy immediately fled. Because her curtains were open, her life was saved, essentially. That is her claim. So we have an instance where Bundy made this targeted attack on a sorority house. He was attempting to achieve 4 victims. Now, after he fled, he actually went down the road and attacked another victim who also thankfully survived. But we have a sorority house where Bundy basically targeted 4 victims. 2 of those victims died, 2 survived. It was a messy scene. So, in modern day terms, they would have had enough forensics to nab him straight away. I believe that for someone obsessed with Bundy, someone who is a criminology student, someone who had studied crime scene processing, that Kohberger believed that he could do a better job than Bundy, and that this crime was his attempt to perfect Bundy's crime. How does this relate to Harsh's argument? One of the arguments that has been pushed by Prohbergers since this crime occurred was that one person couldn't possibly have done the entire thing, and one person could not have possibly done it in that time frame. And yet, Ted Bundy already achieved that, and Kohberger was obsessed with Ted Bundy. Just another connection that I forgot to add in terms of the 2 crimes. Ted Bundy performed his crime sometime between 3:30 and 4 a.m. in the morning. We are talking about not only very, very similar crimes, but crimes which occurred in a very similar time frame. Now, this video is not intended as an attack on harsh reality. This video is me arguing the opposite point to an argument that he made in his own video. I respect the fact that Harsh does actually put in the time to research for the arguments that he makes and to produce receipts for his arguments. However, in this instance, I feel that his argument falls a little bit short. I will of course provide the link for Harsh's video in the description section of this video, so that should you wish to go and watch his video in full, or any of his other videos relating to Bryan Kohberger, then you can do so. I just do need to request that you are respectful if you go over and watch his videos. Because while I do personally disagree with the viewpoint that he is presenting, I do support him as a channel creator because I see someone who doesn't present clickbait, someone who researches and presents information that they have actually looked into rather than just jumping on the bandwagon. Someone who actually does do the research to back up their arguments. So on that note, thank you for listening. If you are new to my channel, please subscribe. Also, please help my channel to grow, help me to get my videos out there into the algorithm, and to do that, you can click the like button and leave a comment below. Thank you, and I'll catch you in the next one.
I begin to wonder